In Chapter 38. We were playing fungo in the street in front of Ronnie's house when Puddin' hit a pop-up. In right field, Ronnie's front yard, Freako Nature raised his mitt and backed up to catch it. Then he stopped. The ball bounced 6 feet to his right, but Freako Nature was still staring at the sky. Way, way up, 3 tiny silver jets were streaking across the blue, leaving white contrails. They were so high, we couldn't even hear them. I'd never seen planes that high in the sky before. Air Force jets, said Why Can't You Be Like Johnny. How do you know? Asked Ronnie. Commercial flights don't fly that high or close together. Think it's war? Freako Nature asked nervously. Wouldn't there be sirens? I asked. Everyone listened. There were no sirens. Should we get in your bomb shelter just in case? Ronnie said. Why Can't You Be Like Johnny turned to Freako Nature. Try your radio. We listened. Stations were playing music or people were talking. Sounds pretty normal, I said. But we kept listening, as if at any second the sirens would start, or a voice would come on the radio and tell everyone to seek shelter. Finally, Why Can't You Be Like Johnny suggested we keep playing and check the radio again in a little while. I went back to first base, the storm drain. Johnny was playing second, chalked on the asphalt. Puddin' was in left field, Old Lady Lester's front yard. Ronnie went to home plate and was about to hit when Paula came by pushing her twin brother, Teddy, in his wheelchair. Teddy had to be strapped in and couldn't talk. His head would roll around, and he'd make strange faces and stick his fingers in his ears. Sometimes Paula would talk to him, but it was hard to tell if he understood. Sparky was afraid of Teddy, and the rest of us felt uncomfortable when he was around. On the sidewalk, Paula locked the wheelchair's brakes and sat down on the edge of Old Lady Lester's lawn, right in the middle of left field. You can't sit there, Ronnie called from home plate. You don't own the sidewalk, Paula yelled back. Can't you find someplace else? No. We couldn't risk hitting Teddy with the ball. Why Can't You Be Like Johnny left second base and sat down on Ronnie's lawn, and the rest of us followed. We stared across the street at Paula and Teddy. Paula stared back. Want to throw rocks at her? Suggested Puddin'. That was his standard solution to almost any problem. Why Can't You Be Like Johnny shook his head. Just wait. You think if we don't play, she'll get bored and go? Asked Freako Nature. Don't bet on it, grumbled Ronnie. He and Paula had a strange relationship. They acted like they hated each other, but at the same time couldn't stay away from one another. So we looked at Paula, and she looked at us. Finally, Why Can't You Be Like Johnny went home. Then Freako Nature and Puddin' decided to go too. That left Ronnie and me. I didn't want to go home. Lately, Mom was acting really moody, and I never knew what to expect. 1 minute she'd yell at you for the littlest thing, and the next, she'd act like she didn't care what you did. Sneak into your mom's room yet? Ronnie asked in a low voice. No. What about your father's Playboys? What do you care? Ronnie glanced across the street at Paula, then whispered, Just hate to think of you dying without ever seeing... I'm not going to die, remember? I'm the one with the bomb shelter, and I'll be in there for weeks with my mom and get to see everything. You might not, Ronnie said. Might be pretty dark. It's not like you'll have electricity. Like a dog on the other end of a stick, he wouldn't let go. And moms don't really count because you can't do anything with them, he said. Wouldn't you like to see some you could do something with? Do what? You don't know? Ronnie asked in that tone that always made me feel like I was stupid. Go to hell. Keep it down, Ronnie mumbled and glanced across the street again. If you could see any pair of breasts in the whole world, whose would you want to see? How would I know? Paula's, right? He whispered. The thought had never occurred to me. Paula might have had breasts, but she was also our neighbor and the annoying teacher's pet who always raised her hand in class. No, I said. Yes, you do. No, I don't. Ronnie studied me. You a homo? A what? A homo. A queer. No. Sure you are. Any guy who doesn't care about breasts has to be queer. No, you don't, I said. What do breasts have to do with it? Across the street, Paula got up and started to push Teddy back home. Maybe she'd decided there was no point in being there if we weren't going to pay attention to her. You don't even know what queer is, Ronnie sneered. Yes, I do. No, you don't. Do too. Oh, yeah? Then what is it? It's, when you're, kind of strange and different. Ronnie's grin grew broader. You don't know what queer means, he sang like it was a line from a song. That's what it means, I insisted. No, it doesn't, Ronnie said. It means you like other guys. I studied him uncertainly. I liked my friends, most of the time at least, and they were guys. What was queer about that? Ronnie saw the confusion on my face. Queers are guys who have sex with other guys. They're called homos because they're homosexuals. I smiled. There was no way Ronnie was going to get away with this one. Guys can't have sex with guys. It's not even possible, stupid. But Ronnie smiled back. What rock have you been hiding under? It didn't make sense. Men and women had body parts that fit together. Men couldn't have sex with men because they had the same body parts and therefore wouldn't fit. So how do they do it? I asked. Ronnie shook his head like he knew the answer and didn't want to tell. Come on, if you're so smart, let's hear it, I said. I would, but if your parents found out, they'd be really mad. I swear to God I won't tell them. How do I know you'll keep your promise? I held out my right pinky, and Ronnie stopped smiling. A pinky swear was the most inviolate swear there was. If you broke a pinky swear, you were branded for life. No one would ever trust you again. Come on, I beckoned with my outstretched pinky. Ronnie didn't take it. See, I said, you're such a liar. Chapter 39. I'm hungry. Sparky crosses his arms over his stomach and bends forward like he's in agony. Even before this, he was skinny and bony, but now his ribs poke out, especially where the concave curve of his stomach begins. There. Janet puts her arm around his shoulders and tries to soothe him. He sits with her almost all the time now. Give him something, Mrs. Shaw says to Dad. What about my child? Asks Mr. McGovern. Hunger has turned my stomach into a knot too, and my own ribs feel tight against my skin. But I don't want to say anything that will make it worse for Dad, who goes over to the shelf. Sardines? Sparky shakes his head. Tuna? Okay. Why does he get to choose when the rest of us don't? Mr. McGovern asks. If your child was the youngest here, I'd do the same for her, Dad answers. But not if she's the second or third youngest? That makes no sense, Richard, Mrs. Shaw says. I hate the way she and Mr. McGovern gang up on Dad. It's still our bomb shelter and our food. Like Dad said, they could have built their own shelters. I'm hungry too, says Ronnie. What's left? Asks Mrs. Shaw. Mr. Shaw hardly talks anymore. Mostly he just stares at the walls and floor. It makes me uncomfortable. He seems like a different person from the one who sat in his den sipping wine and talking about topless women in France. Dad tells us what remains on the food shelf. 3 cans of Spam, 4 of tuna, 6 of sardines, and some peanut butter and jelly. No bread? Asks Mrs. Shaw. Dad shakes his head. We could make it last longer, Mr. McGovern says. For someone hard-headed and logical enough to build this shelter, you've become awfully soft-hearted, Richard. Dad glares at him furiously. You're talking about my wife and this innocent woman, Herb. I'm talking about our lives and the lives of our children, Mr. McGovern replies forcefully. We've already lost enough thanks to this goddamn war. The sooner we use up the food, the sooner we'll be forced to go back up there. And if we go up too soon, we run the risk of radiation sickness. Be rational about it, Richard. It's not going to get any easier once we're up there. Like Stephanie said, we'll be spending every moment trying to survive. There won't be time for anyone who needs help. How can you say that? Dad asks. I mean, think of your own son. Mr. McGovern's face darkens. That is exactly why I can say it. I feel the urge to tug. The spot behind my right ear feels as smooth and hairless as my forehead. But along the edge of the bald spot, I find some hairs to grasp. Mr. McGovern doesn't think we'll be able to take care of Mom once we get out. But why does he want Janet to leave? Because she's a Negro? If he makes her leave, what's to stop him from saying Sparky should go next? After all, he's too young and small to take care of himself. So? Mr. McGovern demands. Dad gathers himself up. I said it before, and I'll say it again. Over my dead body. It won't just be your dead body, it will be everyone's. Mr. McGovern counters, then turns to the Shaws. Who gave him the right to make decisions for all of us? Because it's his bomb shelter? I'm sorry, but I don't think that matters anymore. We're all in this together now. Are you really comfortable putting your lives in his hands? Letting him decide how much we eat and drink? Mrs. Shaw glances at her husband, who's staring at a wall as if his thoughts are 1,000,000 miles away. Then she says in a softer, more reasonable tone, Let the children eat, Richard. I never said I wasn't going to, Dad replies icily. He opens a can of tuna and divides it 4 ways. Normally I could eat my share in 1 bite, but I separate it into 3 parts and savor each one slowly. Sparky gets to lick the inside of the can. When I finish my 3 parts, I'm still hungry. Sometimes, when it's quiet for a long time, I think I hear whispers, as if there's someone else down here. And even though I don't believe in ghosts, I get scared. If I never imagined the whole world being destroyed, what else have I never imagined? Could there be some kind of invisible radioactive creature on the other side of the shield wall? Invisible Godzilla? I look over at Mom, wishing she would wake up so I could tell her about Invisible Godzilla, and she could tell me it's only my imagination. But she just lies there, blank-eyed. So I go over to Janet and hold her hand. If Mr. McGovern and the Shaws say she has to go, I'll say over my dead body too. When we run out of rags for washing and the toilet, the men tear off their pajama legs at the knees. We're slowly using up our clothing. At times, the hunger and the feeling of being cooped up in this chilly, smelly dungeon is so bad, I feel like I can't spend another minute down here. Would it be worth risking radiation poisoning to go up and see the sun for a few minutes? Could such a short time up there be that bad? Dad and Mr. McGovern have an argument over how long we've been down here. Dad thinks it's only been 5 or 6 days. Mr. McGovern insists it's been 8 or 9. This is more than a week's worth of beard, Mr. McGovern says, brushing the stubble that mats the lower half of his face. The lower half of Dad's face is similarly darkened, but Mr. Shaw's is only patchy, and I wonder if he could grow a beard even if he wanted to. Maybe it's time to check the radiation levels again, Mrs. Shaw says in her nice voice. Dad starts to get to his feet, then stumbles and has to grab the bunk bed. Dad! Sparky blurts with fright. Sorry, just got a little dizzy. Hunger, Mr. McGovern grumbles as if it's Dad's fault. When Dad picks up the flashlight, Sparky whimpers. Janet presses the side of his head to her bosom and comforts him. He'll just be gone for a moment. At the shelf lined with supplies, Dad aims the flashlight beam at the green box as if he's thinking about what's inside. Then he takes the family radiation measurement kit and goes into the corridor on the other side of the shield wall. Once again, without the flashlight, it gets darker in the shelter. Then he's back. 160 Roentgens. Isn't that much better than before? Mrs. Shaw asks hopefully. Dad nods grimly. It's still much too high. There's nothing on the radio. I guess the good news is you're not picking up any stations in Russian, says Mr. McGovern. I'd almost feel better if we did, mumbles Mr. Shaw. It feels like it's the first time he's spoken in days. Ronnie scowls at his dad. Why? At least we'd know someone was out there, Mr. Shaw replies. Mr. McGovern, who always has to have the last word, mutters, better dead than red. Chapter 40. Take cover! We're under attack! We were in the middle of learning ratios when Principal Sharp's voice crackled over the PA system. Follow your teacher's instructions. Duck and cover. Duck and cover. Puddin' Wright ran to the windows. A few weeks earlier, Principal Sharp had told each teacher to select a student to pull down the window shade so we wouldn't be blinded or burned by the nuclear flash. It sounded like an important job, but Mr. Cassman chose Puddin', who now pulled a shade so hard that the whole thing came crashing down. Ah! Paula wailed. Oh, for Christ's sake, Mr. Cassman sputtered. Kids dove for the floor. Stop! Mr. Cassman shouted. It's not an attack. It's just a drill. But Principal Sharp said, be quiet, our teacher ordered. Do you hear sirens? We listened. There were no sirens. Why did Principal Sharp say we were under attack? Asked Freako Nature. Instead of answering, Mr. Cassman closed his eyes and squeezed the bridge of his nose with his fingertips as if he was getting a headache. Should we still get under our desks? Ronnie asked. Our teacher took his hand away from his face. Sure, go ahead. He sounded like he didn't care. It wasn't easy. Our new desks came with chairs that were attached. We were crawling around on the floor, trying to get under them, when the PA crackled back on. There's been some confusion, said Principal Sharp. We are not under attack. I repeat, we are not under attack. This is an air raid drill. I repeat, this is only a drill. Teachers, escort your students into the hallway and await further instructions. You heard him, said Mr. Cassman. Everyone out to the hall. We wiped our dirty hands on our pants and filed out. Up and down the corridor, kids were pouring from classrooms. Some of the girls were red-eyed and teary, and some boys looked pale and shaken, as if their teachers had believed it was a real attack too. Students, sit with your backs against lockers, your knees pulled up, and your faces buried in your arms, Principal Sharp announced over the loudspeaker. Do as he said, instructed Mr. Cassman. I have ordered you out into the hall because in the event of a nuclear attack, this will protect you from flying glass and flash burns, Principal Sharp continued. You will keep your eyes shut and covered to prevent blindness from the flash. No matter where you are, do not look at the blast. Always turn your back to it and look away. Always, Mr. Cassman repeated. Chapter 41. The hunger pangs have gone from sharp to dull, but constant. Everyone's irritable. Ronnie's winning a game of Parcheesi until Sparky rolls a 6 and knocks one of his pawns back to the start. Why'd you do that? Ronnie asks. You could have used that roll to get your pawn home. I can do that later, Sparky replies. Why not now? Ronnie asks. If I don't send your pawn back, you'll win. No, I won't, Ronnie says, which is dumb because he wants to win, and getting all your pieces home is how you do it. Sure you will, I tell him. Maybe not, Ronnie says. Maybe I would have slowed down just to make it interesting. So Sparky did that for you. I chip in. It wasn't the right move. He can make any move he wants, I tell him. He would have been better off going home. But then you would have won. I quit. Ronnie flips a corner of the board and pawns go rolling everywhere. That ticks me off. You're just mad because you thought you were going to win and then Sparky messed you up. You're stupid. I may be stupid, but even my little brother's smarter than you. Oh, yeah? Well, your dad's so dumb, he didn't put enough food or clothes in here. Silence. Dad winces. Ronnie! Mrs. Shaw snaps, which is a little surprising because she said the same thing about Dad a few days ago. Well, it's... Ronnie begins, but doesn't finish. Not that it matters. Everyone knows he was going to say it's true. I wonder if Dad will get mad, but he bows his head. He's right. I could have done better. I should have. I mean, what was the point of building this shelter and then leaving the job unfinished? That's the thing about Dad. Maybe he isn't as smart as Mr. McGovern or as suave as Mr. Shaw. But when he realizes he's wrong, he admits it. Not a lot of parents do that. Kids either. Mrs. Shaw must feel bad about being so critical of him because now she says, "You did just fine, Richard. If it wasn't for you, none of us would be alive." Whoop-de-doo. Mr. Shaw goes, like he doesn't think being alive is so great. Stephen! Mrs. Shaw hushes him, as if instead of being angry at Dad, she's now angry at him. Mr. Shaw goes back into silent mode, but it's scary to see him act like he's giving up. What if he's right? Chapter 42. When the leaves began to fall, Dad bought a lawn sweeper. It had 4 long brushes on a rotating drum followed by a leaf catcher. You pushed it across the lawn, which made the drum rotate and the brushes turn, sweeping up leaves into the catcher. I had to sweep the whole lawn, which was hard work. But when I dumped a few loads at the curb and had a good-sized pile, I was allowed to pour gasoline on the leaves and light them. Fires were great entertainment. I just made a big pile when Frico Nature rode up on his bike and told me not to burn them until he came back. A little later, he returned with Ronnie and a jar filled with crickets. I got the red gasoline can from the garage and sprinkled some on the leaves. "That's all?" Ronnie asked. "You don't need a lot," I said. "Leaves pretty much burn by themselves." "Put some more on," Ronnie said. So I did. "More," he urged. The leaves glistened, and the odor of gasoline was strong in the air. I carried the can far away, then returned, pulling a pack of matches out of my pocket. Normally, I'd crouch down and light a few leaves, then wait for the flames to reach the gas. But now there was gas everywhere. It had even started to seep from the leaves and spread onto the street. Frico Nature spun the lid off the jar and dumped the crickets onto the pile. Some started to hop away on the street. Others landed on the gasoline-soaked leaves and seemed stunned. "Do it!" Ronnie yelled. I stood back and tossed a lit match toward the pile, but it went out before it hit the leaves. I lit another and tossed it, but the same thing happened. Meanwhile, more crickets were getting away. "Give me that!" Ronnie grabbed the matches and crouched close to the pile. Hump! I could have sworn that for an instant Ronnie disappeared in the 8-foot-high ball of flames. The initial burst quickly died down, the crackling leaves burning rapidly, turning bright red and then into ashes. Crickets jumped around frantically in the orange and yellow flames before being immolated. A few even managed to launch themselves, burning, to the pavement, where they kicked once or twice, then lay still, tiny carcasses and smoke. My friends and I took in the charred devastation, the smoldering heap of gray ash, the wisps of smoke rising like ghosts. All that remained of the crickets were burned carapaces, except for a few dead ones that had managed to hop away before the fire began, only to be poisoned by the gasoline. "Just like what could happen to us," Ronnie said. Chapter 43. When When Dad turns the valves, more water gurgles into the tank. Looks like you were right, he tells Mr. McGovern. Paula's father nods like he knew he was right all along. Then no one else survived, Mr. Shaw mutters. Certainly very few, Mr. McGovern agrees. How do you know? Asks Mrs. Shaw. Mr. McGovern explains how water towers are built to hold about a day's worth of water for the population they serve. So, if we've been down here 9 or 10 days, or 6 or 7, says Dad. Whatever the number, Mr. McGovern says irritably, it must mean very few people are using it. Is it day up there? Night? What day of the week? How many more days do we need to stay down here? Sometimes if I think about it too hard, I feel queasy, like after a roller coaster ride. Mr. McGovern says without knowing day from night that we've become disoriented. Nobody plays games anymore. It takes too much energy. We sit or lie down or sleep. Sometimes someone stands up because they can't sit anymore. I think about Tootsie Rolls, Milky Ways, Frosted Flakes, Rice Krispies, Pop-Tarts, Premium Saltines, Oreos, Wise potato chips, Fritos, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, milkshakes, hamburgers, Chinese food, spaghetti, pizza, sweet and sour meatballs. My stomach churns and cries. Sometimes drinking water helps, but sometimes it doesn't. The air is always stuffy. We take turns cranking the ventilator, but no one has the strength to crank it more than 3 or 4 times. So there isn't enough food and barely enough air. But that's not the scariest part of being down here. The scariest part is the way the grown-ups act. Check the radiation, Mr. McGovern says. He no longer bothers to ask. I just checked it a few hours ago, Dad replies. That was yesterday, Richard. No, Herb, it was today. Mr. Shaw sighs. What does it matter? Anything would be better than being down here, Mr. McGovern says. You can leave anytime you like, Dad snaps. I'm not the one who should leave. Mr. McGovern's eyes seem full of anger and hatred. Is that what he saved his energy for? I told you I won't have that, Dad growls. Who made you the commander-in-chief? Mr. McGovern turns to Mrs. and Mr. Shaw. I say we vote on reducing the number of mouths by 2. This isn't arbitrary. It's a matter of survival. It's what has to be done if we're going to stay down here long enough to let the danger subside up there. Janet's eyes go wide. As if my stomach doesn't already hurt enough, now it twists and knots even more. Is Dad too tired to argue? When he moves close to the shelves and places his hand near the green box, I feel my heart begin to thump hard, and my breaths grow short and fast. He can't be serious. This can't be happening. But that's what they said about a war with the Russians in the first place. Mr. McGovern finishes his speech. All those in favor of reducing the number of mouths by 2, raise your hands. Dad rests his hand on the green box. Mr. McGovern raises his hand and looks at the Shaws. Neither of them budges. A scowl darkens Mr. McGovern's face. Even though we'll die if we have to go up there too soon? I told you before, says Mrs. Shaw. I'd rather die than be responsible for someone else's death. Stephen, Mr. McGovern says. Mr. Shaw slowly shakes his head. Up there, down here, what difference does it make? Chapter 44. Despite the duck and cover drills and talk about a nuclear war, teachers still had to teach. In current events, Mr. Cassman reminded us that there were other things going on in the world. He wrote James Meredith on the board. Does anyone know who this man is? No one answered. James Meredith? recently became the first colored man ever to enroll in the University of Mississippi, our teacher said. Paula's hand shot up. They didn't want to let him in. That's right, said Mr. Cassman. Paula grinned proudly, as if to say, see how smart I am? But if she was really so smart, how come she wasn't in the smart kid class with Why Can't You Be Like Johnny? And can you tell us who they are, Paula? Mr. Cassman asked. Paula stopped smiling. Some white people? She asked, more than stated. Yes, Mr. Cassman nodded, and Paula looked relieved. But not for long. You're white, Paula. Would you have been against James Meredith going to the University of Mississippi? Paula's eyes darted around nervously. No. Then why do you think those people in Mississippi were against him going? Paula didn't answer, and no hands went up. Except for school custodians and cleaning ladies, we hardly ever came in contact with Negro people. I thought about Janet and the 3 men who dug the hole in our backyard. Who knows what segregation is? Once again, Paula's hand shot up. It's when white people and Negroes are kept separate. Why? Asked Mr. Cassman. It was strange the way he asked us questions instead of just telling us stuff, as if he actually wanted to know what we thought. I couldn't remember a teacher doing that before. Miss Yelnick, my 5th grade teacher, always acted like the last thing she wanted to know was what we thought. After all, we were kids. How were we supposed to know the answers? But the funny thing was, asking us made us think, whereas half the time when teachers told us stuff, it just went in one ear and out the other. In some parts of the South, there are separate restaurants for whites and Negroes, said Mr. Cassman. There are separate water fountains and bathrooms. Negroes have to ride in the back of public buses. Back of the bus. Frico Nature rumbled in a deep, low voice like the kingfishers on the TV show Amos and Andy. Some kids giggled. Mr. Cassman ignored him and waited. You could feel discomfort spread through the classroom. What was he waiting for? Okay. He seemed to make up his mind. Here's part of your homework for tonight. I want each of you to write a page answering this question. He turned to the blackboard and wrote, why would someone be against letting a Negro go to an all-white university? And do you agree or disagree with that position? A bunch of us groaned, but then we always groaned when Mr. Cassman gave us homework. That night, I wrote, I think people who are against letting a Negro go to an all-white university probably think that Negroes shouldn't go to college because they were once slaves. I think this is wrong because Negroes are not slaves anymore. It is wrong for people to be against letting a Negro go to an all-white university because they think that Negroes shouldn't go to college because they were once slaves. I think those people should think about how they would feel if Negroes had made white people slaves instead of the other way around. I don't think white people would like it one bit if they wanted to go to an all-Negro college and weren't allowed. The Golden Rule says we should do unto others as they would do unto us. In conclusion, it is wrong for white people to be against letting a Negro go to an all-white university because they think that Negroes shouldn't go to college because they were once slaves. Chapter 45. The refuse can is almost full, Dad says. So, what do you suggest, Herr Capitan? Asks Mr. McGovern, as if he's hoping maybe this could be another reason to reduce the number of mouths by 2. Oh, am I still in charge? Dad asks sarcastically. Suppose we just put the solid waste in it, Mrs. Shaw asks. Dad nods. That's what I was thinking. So now liquid waste goes directly into the drain on the floor. The men stand, the women squat. People don't always hold up the blanket for privacy anymore. It takes too much energy. The men just turn their backs and go. Janet and Mrs. Shaw hold the blanket for Paula. Dad and Janet take Mom by the arms and help her to squat. Seeing people go now, I feel the way I used to feel when one of our neighbor's dogs went. What's the big deal? Why was it ever a big deal? Out of the blue, Mr. Shaw says, "We're worse than animals. Animals only kill what they need for food. Humans kill for no reason." Eyes shift as we glance at one another. No one replies. Dad tries the radio. There have got to be others. Sooner or later, someone has to start broadcasting. Powered by what? Mr. McGovern sighs like parents do when their kids act stubbornly. You think the power plants are still standing? And even if they are, you think the people who run them are still alive? And they're just going to go back to work? What's the point? To earn a salary? Who's going to pay them? And even if someone did, what would they do with the money? Go to a store? There's nothing to buy. No one's going back to work, Richard. No one's making anything. They're all too busy just trying to survive. The government made contingency plans, Dad counters. They stored food and gasoline. The Army will get things going again. Mr. McGovern rolls his eyes. You've been completely brainwashed. Do you have any idea how much food and fuel it takes to keep this country running? It doesn't matter what the government has stored. Without a constant supply of new coal, oil, and natural gas, whatever they've got won't last more than a month or two. So, unless the Army is going to start mining and drilling, and processing and refining, and transporting and running power plants, it can't possibly go back to the way it was. Nobody argues. Dad has his listening and thinking face on. And I'll tell you something else, Mr. McGovern continues. Our power plants and refineries were probably the first things the Russians bombed. Just like their power plants and oil fields were the first things we bombed. And it's not like we can rebuild whatever was damaged. Anything that got a direct hit from a nuclear weapon will be radioactive for decades, if not centuries. So to have the energy we need means digging new mines and oil wells, as well as building new power plants. How long do you think that will take? Dad doesn't answer. How long? asks Sparky. Not in our lifetimes, Mr. McGovern answers, still focusing on Dad. Maybe now you can understand why some of us weren't in a hurry to build bomb shelters. He makes it sound like it's going to be really awful when we go back up there. Almost like, as horrible as it is down here, we might be better off staying. Meanwhile, Dad turns to Paula's father. You know, Herb, he says, in some ways, you're a very smart guy. But in other ways, you're one of the stupidest people I've ever met. In the shadows of our dungeon, tension once again begins to spread. I've never heard a grown-up call another grown-up a name before. Certainly not to his face. And not only that, but I never thought Dad would be the one to do it. At first, Mr. McGovern clenches his teeth. But then he seems to relax and even smiles. All right, Richard. Perhaps you'd like to tell us what makes you say that. You fought to get in here because when faced with death, you realized how precious life is, Dad says. I can't imagine how horrible it must have been to leave your wife and son up there, but you made that choice. We all did, or we wouldn't be down here. None of us really knows what it's going to be like when we get back up there. In the meantime, all we've got to keep us going is hope. But you're so damn intent on proving to everyone how smart you are that you don't seem to care that you're destroying the last bit of hope the rest of us are clinging to. So from now on, keep it to yourself. But we know who always has to have the last word. According to Nietzsche, Paula's father replies, in reality, hope is the worst of all evils because it prolongs man's torments. Chapter 46. Dad brought home a brown paper shopping bag with handles made from bamboo and wire. What is it? Sparky asked eagerly. I'll show you after dinner. Dad said. That always drove Sparky and me crazy. Maybe it was supposed to teach us patience, but all it really did was make us rush through meals. To make things worse, Mom served spinach. Except for canned asparagus, there was nothing Sparky and I hated more. But dinner couldn't end until we finished it. I put lots of butter on mine and managed to eat most of it. About halfway through the meal, Sparky got up to go to the bathroom. He didn't come back. After a while, Dad said, "Go see what Edward's doing." As I went down the hall to the bathroom, I heard the toilet flush. Then it flushed again. I knocked. "Who is it?" Sparky asked. "Me," I said in a low voice. "What's going on?" Sparky peeked out, then let me in and locked the door. In the toilet were a million little green pieces of spinach. "I spit it out," he whispered. "But it won't flush." This was bad. If Mom or Dad found out that Sparky had filled his mouth with spinach and then spit it out, we might not get to see what Dad brought home. I flushed the toilet. The water swirled around and disappeared, then reappeared with most of those little green pieces of spinach still there. Rap, rap. A knock on the door made us both jump. "Boys?" Sparky's eyes went wide. "Open the door," Dad ordered. Sparky and I shared a frightened look. As I opened the door, Sparky quickly put down the toilet top and sat. Dad scowled at us. "What's going on?" "We were just talking," Sparky said. "With the door locked?" Dad asked. "It was boy stuff," I said. Dad frowned. "Well, come on and see what I got." As we followed Dad down the hall, Sparky rolled his eyes in relief. In the bedroom, Dad took 4 olive-colored masks out of the shopping bag. Each was about the size of a football with U.S. non-combatant gas mask stenciled in black letters on the outside. They were made of rubber with 2 clear plastic see-through discs. At one end was a gray canister about the size of a Campbell's soup can. At the other end were straps. Sparky put one on, instinctively knowing that the straps went around the back of his head and the clear plastic discs went where his eyes were. He looked like a green anteater with the gray can for a snout. I followed his example. Dad tightened the straps until the gas masks felt firm on our heads. The air inside quickly became warm and stale. "What's it for?" I asked, my voice muffled by the mask. "So you won't breathe in radioactive fallout," Dad said. Mom came in. When she saw Sparky and me, she frowned. "They're gas masks, Mom," Sparky announced with muffled excitement. Mom crossed her arms and said to Dad, "Scaring them again?" "We're not scared," Sparky said. But then he turned to me and asked uncertainly, "Are we?" "I'm not scared," I said, because I didn't want Dad to get into trouble. "You better take those off," Dad said. "And go watch TV," added Mom in a way that indicated that Dad was in trouble anyway. We went into the den and watched Sky King, but I could hear the sounds of an argument coming from Mom and Dad's bedroom. Sparky's eyes were fixed on the TV. I got up and quietly went down the hall to listen. "The whole town's talking," Mom said. "They stare at me in the store. I can feel their eyes." "I'm sorry," Dad said, "but I can't sit here and do nothing. Even President Kennedy said we should build a shelter. He's building one at his summer place in Hyannisport, and we all know there's got to be an enormous shelter in Washington." "Well, good for him." Meanwhile, Scott's pulling the hair out of his head and is so worried he threw up his dinner. "What?" I had to get closer to try to hear what Mom said next. Suddenly, the door swung open. Dad looked startled when he saw me. "You were listening?" I bowed my head in shame. "You threw up?" "Ah!" Halfway down the hall, Sparky let out a cry and dashed away. He must have been coming to see what we were talking about. "I'll take care of him," Mom went past us. In a low voice, I told Dad that I hadn't thrown up, but that Sparky had been so eager to see what was in the shopping bag that he'd filled his mouth with spinach and spit it out in the toilet. Dad sighed, then reached out and turned my head with his hand. "What's this?" "I don't know." "You pull out hair when you're worried?" I nodded. "Try not to, okay?" Chapter 47. In order to have toilet paper and washcloths, we've torn our nightclothes down to almost nothing. Paula and Janet clutch what remains of their robes tightly when they move around, but Mrs. Shaw can't be bothered and lets her shredded robe hang open, revealing the nakedness beneath. I guess she knows that we're all so hungry, weak, and miserable that no one cares. "I can't stand it." Mr. Shaw suddenly pushes himself up. It seems like the first time he stood up in days, although that probably isn't true. He stumbles toward the gap in the shield wall. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Shaw gasps. "I'll take my chances up there." "Dad!" Ronnie dashes after his father and wraps his arms around one of his legs. Shock and alarm fill the shelter. For an instant, my dad looks dumbfounded. Then he hoists himself up and grabs Mr. Shaw's arm. "Let go!" Mr. Shaw tries to yank free. "You'll kill us all," Dad warns. "I can't stay in here anymore." "Dad, stop!" Ronnie cries as his father tries to drag him. "You're scaring him, Stephen!" Mrs. Shaw yells. With Ronnie's arms wrapped around his thigh like a boa constrictor, Mr. Shaw tries to squirm out of Dad's grip in a strange, slow-motion dance as if they don't have the strength to move faster. Dad hooks an arm around Mr. Shaw's neck, and they tumble to the shelter floor, a mass of squirming arms and legs. "Let go!" On the floor, Mr. Shaw tries to wriggle and twist away, but Ronnie's still clamped to his leg, and Dad manages to pin his arms down. Ronnie's crying, and Mrs. Shaw is yelling, "Stop it! Stop it!" Mr. Shaw twists his head back and forth and tries to kick with his free leg. "Let me go!" But Dad has him pinned. "If you open that door now, the radioactive dust that falls in could kill us all." Her hair a wild mess, Mrs. Shaw kneels and takes her husband's head in her hands. "Stop," she says gently but firmly. "Get a hold of yourself. I understand how you feel, I really do. But you have to think about the rest of us. Ronnie needs you. I need you." Her words get through. Mr. Shaw goes limp. The back of his head rests on the floor, and he bursts into tears, hiccuping and snorting, his chest heaving. I've never seen a grown man cry so publicly before, and it feels strange and upsetting. Sparky's whimpering. Janet strokes his head reassuringly. Paula's eyes are wide as she clings to her father. We're all so close together. There's nowhere to hide. Ronnie lets go of his father's leg and sits on the floor, wiping his eyes, his face smudged with tears and dirt. Mrs. Shaw helps her husband to one of the bunks and lies down with him. She kisses his face and whispers in his ear. He slides his arms around her and pulls her close. I feel bad that they can't be alone. Dad watches Mrs. Shaw caress and soothe her husband. He turns his gaze to Janet hugging Sparky. Then he looks at Mom, lying on her bunk with that blank expression, not the slightest bit aware of what just happened. Dad doesn't check the radio anymore, but whenever he wakes up from a nap, he goes around the shield wall and tests the radiation levels under the trap door. 127, he reports. It's dropped again, but it's still high above the safe level. Meanwhile, we're slowly starving to death.